The WWE's new generation was a transitional period between the much more successful and better known rock and wrestling boom of the 80s and the Attitude Era of the late 90s. Reeling from a steroid scandal that resulted in waning attendance and the near imprisonment of owner Vince McMahon, the company would move in a new direction. The synthetically enhanced bodybuilders that had defined the WWE in the 1980s would be phased out, and new, younger talent would be pushed in their place. While this short era produced some of the greatest stars in the history of the business and is often fondly remembered by viewers, it can't be denied that the new generation era was a time of great turmoil, in which the company faced record low attendance and increased competition from Ted Turner's WCW. With the territory system all but dead, and popular mainstays like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior gone from the company, the WWE would have to make new stars. Nelson Frazier Jr. would sign with the WWE in 1993, along with his tag team partner, Robert Lawrence Horn. The two had previously worked together as the Harlem Knights in the Memphis-based United States Wrestling Association. They would debut on an episode of WWF Superstars in July of that year, repackaged as Mabel and Mo respectively. Combined with their rapping manager Oscar, the trio would form Men on a Mission, a stable committed to bringing about positive change in their neighborhood via professional wrestling. This was an era plagued with bad gimmicks. It was a time when nearly every new wrestler supposedly also held some other part-time job. Rapping community activist was more subtle than usual. Mabel would actually claim that the team's original name was meant to be Men from a Mission. And instead of purple and gold, the group was to wear a bunch of tattered rags sewn together to look like garbage. How can a homeless person weigh 500 pounds? Men on a Mission would have moderate success in the tag team division, eventually defeating the Quebecers at an English house show in March of 1994 to win the titles, only to lose them back 2 days later. In mid-94, Mabel would have a brief run as a singles competitor, where he'd reach the quarterfinals of that year's King of the Ring tournament, only to be eliminated by IRS. The group would resume tagging later that year, but without much success. Following the loss to the Smoking Guns in the March 12, 1995 episode of WWF Action Zone, Mo and Mabel would turn heel, brutally beating down the unsuspecting Guns. Their manager Oscar would attempt to apologize to the Guns on the next week's episode, only to be attacked by Mo and Mabel, cementing their heel turn. In a 2009 interview, Oscar would claim that the original plans called for him to remain with the team, but he elected to leave the company because he didn't want to portray a negative image on TV. Men on a Mission would emerge victorious from their short feud with the Smoking Guns, and Mabel would receive a major singles push. Let's take a look at this bracket. We have Mabel, Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Bob Holly, The Road Dogg, Savio Vega, and Yokozuna. The Undertaker was in the midst of a long feud with various members of Ted DiBiase's $1 Million Corporation. He was being underutilized in this role and had been generally kept away from the world title scene since his short reign after his original debut. Winning the tournament could change all that. Shawn Michaels had won the Royal Rumble that year but had been defeated by Diesel at WrestleMania 11. Although he'd yet to win the world title, Shawn was slowly becoming the face of the promotion and was probably the most popular star on the roster at this point. Winning the King of the Ring would likely force a rematch against Diesel at SummerSlam. It just seemed so obvious that one of these two would win. The only other wrestler on this list with any business winning this tournament would be Yokozuna. A former two-time world champion, Yokozuna had returned as Owen Hart's secret tag team partner at WrestleMania 11. The two were the reigning tag team champions at this time. Formerly Papa Shango, was a member of Ted DiBiase's heel corporation. He was working a sort of early MMA shoot fighter gimmick, feuding with The Undertaker, whose urn he'd stolen at WrestleMania 11. The character had yet to win a match on pay-per-view. Bob Sparkplug Holly was nestled deep in the undercard, a position he'd occupy for the next 14 years of his employment. His participation in this tournament was surprising enough in itself. The Roadie would of course go on to form one of the most successful tag teams in WWE history, but prior to this event he hadn't even been booked as a wrestler. Jeff Jarrett's former manager was not expected to go far. Savio Vega was a complete unknown. He jumped the guardrail the previous month at In Your House 1 to save Razor Ramon from Double J and his Roadie. Later that night, Razor had introduced Savio as his childhood friend. The guy wasn't in great shape and wrestled in a shirt and pants. For all I knew, he really was just some friend of Razor's. The show would commence with Savio Vega defeating Yokozuna by countout, and the roadie would pin Bob Holly in a confusing finish that looked a lot like a botch. They could have gone either direction in both these matches, and there was really nothing to care about. However, the third match would see Shawn Michaels battle Kama to a 15-minute draw, resulting in both men being eliminated from the tournament. To say this was disappointing would be an understatement. I think every single person who ordered this pay-per-view did so because they wanted to see Shawn Michaels wrestle 3 matches and win the crown. But somehow he couldn't put away Kama in 15 minutes. But there was still hope with The Undertaker. Mabel would make his way to the ring accompanied by Mo, clad in a tent-sized golden jacket. In a complete departure from the norm today, he'd actually stop midway through his entrance to cut a short promo, promising his victory. The Undertaker would make his iconic entrance as usual. The match would begin with the 2 trading blows. It would take 3 clotheslines for The Undertaker to knock the big man from his feet, and he'd follow it up with an old school from the top rope. From here, Mabel would execute a horrific-looking bossman slam, only for The Undertaker to rise from the dead. The Undertaker would be thrown to the outside, only to become helplessly stuck in the ropes, and Mabel would eventually have to stop attacking and assist the referee in freeing him, so the match could proceed. Mo would attempt to interfere, distracting Taker and allowing Mabel to hit a belly-to-belly suplex before locking him into a rear chin lock. The commentators would attribute The Undertaker's poor performance to a lack of power caused by the theft of his precious urn. The match would go to the outside, where Mo would deliver a cheap shot when the ref wasn't looking. Back inside, Mabel would continue to punish the dead man, but The Undertaker would regain the upper hand following a counter in the corner, only for Mabel to deliver a pile driver for a 2 count. A missed clothesline would see a shoulder tackle and both men would be down for the count. Mabel would recover first and attempt an elbow drop, only for The Undertaker to roll away, retaking control with a corner splash. A ref bump would be shortly followed by a choke slam, and Kama would make a run-in, kicking The Undertaker in his head in utter shock and dismay. At this point, there was no salvaging this tournament. The conclusion was obvious, and we all would just have to live with it. Mabel would receive a bye in the next round due to the double elimination of Shawn and Kama. Brutal beatdown on Razor Ramon would ensue, and then the King would take his throne. Mo would personally perform the coronation, while the disgusted crowd hurled garbage at both of them. In the following issue of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Dave Meltzer would write that what happened at King of the Ring wasn't unusual. When business is down, McMahon goes with his instinct. His instinct is to push somebody big, regardless of talent or crowd interest. Beginning the next night on Raw, King Mabel would take on a persona of royalty, wielding a broadsword and being carried to the ring by a group of visibly struggling jobbers. Make a Difference Fatu would essentially recycle the inner city do-gooder gimmick. In Your House 2 would see Men on a Mission defeat the team of Savio Vega and Razor Ramon in a clean victory, following a belly-to-belly suplex on Razor. Later that night, Mabel would join the other heels and Psycho Sid's team of lumberjacks in the main event. Near the conclusion of the match, King Mabel would pull Diesel from the ring and viciously attack him while the other heels stood guard, preventing any of the face lumberjacks from making the save. Nonetheless, Diesel would retain his title following a big boot to Sid, and he and Mabel would attempt a brawl at the match's conclusion. It's a misconception that winning the King of the Ring guaranteed the victor a title shot at SummerSlam. In fact, the next night on Raw, announcer Todd Pettendale would state that King Mabel had only declared himself the #1 contender. And as no one was willing to argue with him, the match was made official. Mabel would cut a pre-taped promo, referring to Diesel as Big Daddy Fool, and incorrectly stating that he went through 3 grueling rounds in one night to win the crown. Mabel would make short work of jobber Nick Barbary, before cutting a promo telling the crowd to bow down to their king. The August 7th, 1995 episode of Monday Night Raw would see Sir Mo take on Diesel in a non-title match. Mabel would come to the ring and attempt to interfere, only to be stopped by Diesel's fellow Clique member Shawn Michaels. The match would continue with both Mabel and Shawn at ringside. Diesel would ultimately win with a powerbomb, only to be laid out by Mabel immediately afterwards. Shawn would attempt to save, but would get a beatdown on the outside. Diesel would recover and attempt the save of his own, only for King Mabel to retreat, taunting the two with his crown. The go-home Raw for SummerSlam would see Men on a Mission defeat 2 jobbers in the opening match. Afterwards, King Mabel would cut a promo randomly challenging the Allied Powers, Lex Luger and Davey Boy Smith, to a tune-up match. would reply that maybe he could and maybe he couldn't, but everyone would find out at SummerSlam. At this point, Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, would enter the ring, stating that Lex Luger wasn't present due to a family emergency. Something about visiting his Uncle Eric, I believe. Davey Boy would accept Men on a Mission's challenge and request that Diesel fill in as his partner. The match would begin and Mabel would announce that the night had been only the first part of his royal plan. SummerSlam 95 would originate from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in front of a crowd reported as over 18,000, and the two would be forced to follow the 25-minute long. This had been a rematch of their legendary encounter at WrestleMania 10. In other words, Mabel and Diesel were dead on arrival. Mabel would be carried to the ring before Mabel would take the upper hand with a shoulder tackle. Into the corner for some chops, and Mabel would start wearing down the champion. Back inside for some more brawl later. Mabel would hit a stoop slam and then bump the ref from the ring, giving Mo his opportunity to interfere. On commentary, McMahon would explain that this was Diesel not knowing if he could trust Luger, which would make sense, but this would be Lex Luger's last appearance on WWE television, and he'd show up on Nitro a little over a week later. Back in the ring, Mabel would perform a belly-to-belly suplex for a 2 count, but miss a fraud splash from the second rope, writing that he was more convinced than ever that Michaels should be the guy the company was built around instead of Diesel. Despite the negative reception of the main event, the show as a whole was well received, mostly due to the ladder match between Shawn and Razor. Observer readers wouldn't even vote Mabel vs. Diesel as the worst match of the night. That honor would go to the women's championship bout between Alundra Blaze and Bertha Faye. As he'd recount in later shoot interviews, Nash felt Mabel was an unsafe worker and had warned him against performing the sit-down splash during their match. According to Nash, his body went numb following the splash, and for a moment he believed he'd never walk again. Mabel apologized profusely. That wasn't enough for Vince McMahon, who was prepared to fire him on the spot rather than leave himself open to the liability. Kevin Nash claims to have talked to McMahon and saved Mabel's job, which had featured The Undertaker fighting himself in the main event. This low buy rate would play a large role in McMahon's decision to remove the title from Diesel at that year's Survivor Series. McMahon had attempted a return to the well, trying to reuse the same formula that worked so well for Hulk Hogan during the 1980s, the face champion taking on the new monster heel. But times were changing, and guys like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart had raised the bar considerably. Fans weren't interested in another overweight, sluggish heel. Mabel had intensity and was an intimidating looking guy with his mohawk and his capped teeth, but he lacked the charisma required to be a top heel. His former status as a long-time mid-card tag wrestler also didn't help. Vince tried to hotshot this singles push with a major tournament win, but it wasn't enough. Fans just didn't believe that someone who'd already spent years in the company with basically nothing to show for it was suddenly a threat to the world champion. According to Mabel, he was informed that he would win the King of the Ring at the 1995 Royal Rumble, so it's odd that the company would wait so long to start his push. He was eliminated in under 2 minutes at the Rumble and didn't even appear at WrestleMania. He would feud with Diesel for the next couple of months after SummerSlam, so you have to ask, if they were already going to turn the Bulldog heel and have him feud with Diesel, why not just let him win the King of the Ring? He's a British wrestler. This gimmick was tailor-made for him. The match was also doomed by its position on the card. Following Shawn Michaels in the mid-90s was challenging under any circumstances, but nothing could follow his second ladder match with Razor Ramon. According to Mabel, he and Nash realized this issue prior to the show and had lobbied McMahon to let the ladder match go on last. However, McMahon refused, insisting that the world title match should close the show. Triple H and Chris Jericho would be outshined in a similar fashion at WrestleMania 18, having to perform before a worn-out crowd that had just witnessed The Rock defeat Hulk Hogan. King Mabel would move on to a feud with The Undertaker and would take part in a rare heel vs. heel match against Yokozuna at In Your House 4. In January of '96, he faced Diesel in a rematch on Raw, which would end in roughly 8 seconds. Following that year's Royal Rumble, he'd lead the company for 2 years, before returning in 1998 in a surprise challenge to that year's King of the Ring winner, Ken Shamrock. Mabel would make his full-time return to the company at the 1999 Royal Rumble, where he'd be kidnapped by The Undertaker's ministry and reintroduced the next night on Raw as Viscera, sort of enforcer for the group. After the ministry disbanded, Viscera would work in the undercard before being released again in August of 2000. He'd make a couple of appearances in TNA, then return to the WWE in late 2004 as the world's largest love machine, a sort of ladies' man gimmick. He'd be drafted to ECW in 2007 and repackaged as Big Daddy V, serving as hired muscle from Matt Striker. In 2008, he'd be drafted back to SmackDown, but would leave the company for good before ever appearing on that brand. Sadly, Nelson Frazier Jr. would pass away in February of 2014. The WWE would honor his memory with an on-screen graphic at the beginning of that week's SmackDown. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you disliked it, give it a thumbs down. Please leave any comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.